Hello and welcome to another instalment of the FIDE Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing China, the coronavirus, and Sinophobia or Sinoscepticism, and whether this is going to become the latest phobia to be used to shut down criticism and dissent. Here to discuss this with me are two experts who've had their fair share of trouble. Benedict Rogers, who's a human rights activist, writer, a leader of the East Asia team at Christian Solidarity Worldwide, as well as the co-founder of Hong Kong Watch, and Andreas Fulda, who's a senior fellow at the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute and author of The Struggle for Democracy in Mainland China, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Andreas has also kindly given me permission to point out that he's also an excellent singer of Chinese folk music, and if I manage to find it on YouTube, so can you. So welcome both of you. Thank you for joining me. Let's jump straight into the latest news. So recent reports suggest that China has pressured the World Health Organization, threatening to stop cooperating with their investigation if they announced that there was a global emergency, all the while stockpiling medical and protective equipment from the US and elsewhere. And German intelligence suggests that this has cost possibly around 4 to 6 weeks in fighting the virus. US Secretary Mike Pompeo accused China of withholding virus samples needed for vaccine research, and the CCP, having seemed to have misled the global community, the Five Eyes, have accused them of an assault on international transparency. So I'd like to start by asking you both, why do you think that this is the way that China dealt with the virus? And what do you think the global ramifications of that are? Ben, would you like to start?
Absolutely. The first thing I should say just before directly answering your question is I think it's incredibly important to distinguish between China and the Chinese Communist Party regime. I know we use China as shorthand, and most of us know that we're talking about the Chinese government. But given that I know we're going to come on later in the discussion to the issue of xenophobia, it's really important that we do make that distinction. I love China. I first went to China when I was 18. I have many Chinese friends. It's a great ancient civilization that has given much to the world. But it's the Chinese Communist Party regime that's been in power for just over 70 years, which is a fraction of China's history, that is the problem. But in answer to your question, the Chinese Communist Party regime operates really with two fundamental principles, I think: fear and lies, or as Chris Patton put it in his letter to the Foreign Secretary, mendacity, which is perhaps a more diplomatic way of saying it. And China does, the CCP does not want to allow the truth about a situation that is challenging to it or problematic to it to be revealed. So in its initial response to the virus, its attitude was to repress the truth rather than repress the virus. And that has led to the pressure on the WHO and all the problems that have affected the world that you've outlined.
Andreas?
Yeah, I would like to echo the point that Ben just made. Of course, we need to distinguish between the party and the good people of China. They're not the same. There is no unity between the rulers and the ruled. And so, yeah, we need to bear this in mind whenever either Ben or I make statements which are critical of the political regime. I would like to also add, one point about the Chinese Communist Party's attitude towards the truth. Now, Professor Steve Zhang once pointed out, and I thought it was very interesting, the Chinese Communist Party holds the monopoly of truth in mainland China. So whether it's the media, social media, the education system, basically the Chinese Communist Party can define what is true or not. But of course, that level of censorship does not yet extend to the global discourse. And this explains also why it appears that the Chinese Communist Party tried so hard to influence the WHO in terms of the public messaging. Because of course, having another global pandemic originating out of China is something, that is highly problematic. It's not good for the reputation of China. It does undermine the authority of the Communist Party. And the more we learn about this sorry saga, the more it transpires that indeed the Chinese government has misled the WHO and by extension the international community.
How do you think, Ben, that this affects international relations, particularly with international organizations? I'm thinking about the WHO in particular. What's the relationship between China and the WHO and other international bodies? And do you think that their record, as Andreas has been saying, in terms of their respect for the truth, whether this actually marks the end of the credibility of the World Health Organization and puts the relationships of other international bodies with China at some kind of increased risk?
Yes, I think we seem to be seeing two things going on in the world, or in parts of the world, which are almost in direct contradiction with each other. We see in the UK, for example, and even more pronounced in the United States, an increasing wakening up to the dangers of the Chinese Communist Party, things that I've been saying for years and was often almost a lone voice, not quite a lone voice because Andreas was saying it too, but now senior politicians who I'd never heard talk about the CCP or China before are saying these things. And I think that's a positive thing. There are calls for a reevaluation of our policy towards the Chinese regime. But in the international organizations, and particularly the WHO, we're seeing almost the opposite trend, where the Chinese government seems to have extraordinary influence and extremely, I would argue, dangerous influence. And one example of that is the total exclusion of Taiwan from the WHO. And Taiwan actually is in stark contrast to the way the CCP handled this crisis. Taiwan is an exemplary model of a government handling the pandemic, both within its own territory extremely well, but also in regard to the rest of the world, being very generous in donating protective equipment and other forms of equipment. And of course, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy, and so there's a stark contrast between a Chinese-speaking democracy and a totalitarian or authoritarian regime across the water. So the CCP's influence in the WHO and in other UN agencies and other international organizations is, I think, very alarming. I have questions. I have sympathy with the US decision to suspend their funding for the WHO. I have question marks over whether it's strategically the right decision, because the concern is you just cede the WHO even more to the CCP's influence. And I would rather governments find ways to reform the WHO and address the imbalance of the CCP's influence there. But it is definitely a major concern.
Andreas, why do you think that China was able to put this pressure on the WHO in the first place? I know that there's been talk about the Director General's historical relationship with China when he was in government in Ethiopia. Do you have any thoughts on the sway that China has over the WHO, and whether it has similar sway over other international organizations? Because I know Ben has mentioned Taiwan already, and obviously that's something that may have impacted the spread of the virus because Taiwan's warnings were ignored as a result of this. So do you have any ideas about the kind of political implications and also the risks involved with China having so much sway over particular organizations like the WHO?
Well, the disastrous performance of the WHO is really indicative of a wider malaise of global governance. So, for example, in recent years, the Chinese Communist Party has extended its influence in various international organizations, not just in the WHO, but think also of Interpol and more recently, the United Nations Human Rights Council. So, for example, let me talk a bit about Interpol. They had a major crisis in 2018 when its head Meng Hongwei suddenly disappeared and was later charged and convicted in mainland China on grounds of corruption. And so this was, a very prominent Chinese citizen leading Interpol. Or more recently, the United Nations Human Rights Council, China has now been granted the right, and I quote, this is, to play a key role in picking the world's body's human rights investigators, including global monitors of freedom of speech, health, enforced disappearances, and arbitrary detention. And that is, of course, a political regime which itself is rightfully accused of endemic and systemic human rights abuses. And so, in a way, our global governance institutions, especially at the United Nations, are not in a good shape. And as such, you don't have to agree with everything that Trump says or Pompeo says when it comes to multilateralism, of course, but that we have a problem with these international organizations is, I think, beyond any doubt.
Ben, you're nodding along. What do you think are the implications of that?
I think the implications, if it's allowed to continue and goes unchallenged, are very serious. I mean, the Chinese regime is clearly trying to completely reframe the human rights framework, and I say that as someone that's my primary focus. And the UN mechanisms, especially the UN Human Rights Council, are incredibly valuable mechanisms for highlighting human rights issues. But if China's influence continues in the way that Andreas has outlined, if it continues further down that path, we're going to be in a new era of not having the framework to properly highlight human rights concerns, but actually distorting and reframing and undermining human rights.
Ben Wallace, the Defense Secretary, he said that China needs to be more open and transparent. And it's been suggested, I think, by some commentators that one of them described the government's response as being weaker than water. And so I was wondering, what do you think that we should be doing to hold China to account? And if so, how? And as you've mentioned, the impact of China on these global organizations and the risks involved with that. What should we be doing to try to sort of leverage our own power strategically to push back against that in our own interests? Ben?
I actually recently wrote an article for the website conservativehome.com, which set out 10 ideas, but there are many more than 10. These were just some of the ideas. But I think, first of all, we should be joining other countries in calling for an international inquiry into the causes of the pandemic. China has already opposed that and will continue, I'm sure, to do so. But I think we should be calling for that. I think we should be strengthening our alliances with like-minded friends and allies, democracies not only in Europe and North America and Australia, but also democracies in the Asia-Pacific region like Japan, South Korea, strengthening our friendship with Taiwan, and trying to better coordinate efforts, because the argument against doing anything about China's influence is, what is Britain's leverage, what is Britain's influence in the world? I think that underestimates our influence, because we do still have a disproportionate amount of influence for a country of our size. But nevertheless, we're much better if we stand together with like-minded allies and coordinate and speak with one voice. There are other things we should also be doing. I think we should definitely be looking at diversifying our supply chain. I don't think anyone realistically would suggest that we should stop all trade with China. I don't think that's really practical, but we should certainly be looking at not being so dependent on China for certain products and strengthening our trading relationships with emerging economies in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, India, Latin America, and so on. I think one of the other things we should absolutely be doing is completely ruling out the deal with Huawei for our 5G network. And although the government has said before the pandemic that would go ahead, I think it's highly likely that it will not go ahead, and I certainly hope that's the case. There are other things we should be doing, but I'll give Andreas a chance to give his views, but those are a few.
Yeah, Andreas, what's your take?
No, I think Ben has made a very comprehensive case for a reformed British China policy. And so I'm very grateful for all these good, ideas and advice. I mean, what I would perhaps add is that what I find heartening is that there is awareness among politicians, but also policymakers and the wider public, how the Communist Party has ramped up intimidation diplomacy tactics. So, for example, there are now a lot of reports about so-called like wolf warrior kind of diplomats who are very intimidating in their exchanges with their Western counterparts. But there is also great awareness now, I think, here in the UK, but also in mainland Europe, how the party state has used corporate interdependence for political interference. Mm-hmm. And of course, now during the COVID crisis, we have also learned, and there's ample evidence for that, that the Communist Party has presented itself as a kind of neutral actor, kind of lending a helping hand, whereas very often, for example, the kind of PPE equipment, when it wasn't actually faulty, when it was delivered from China, those were like commercial transactions. And so I think this kind of, we see a sea change among elite members of the British establishment, but also the European establishment, who realize that we actually have a problem with the Communist Party. And I don't think that they have solutions yet, but the fact that they are listening, to the good advice of Ben and others, I think is again heartening.
Do you think? Oh, sorry, Ben's going to come in.
So, my apologies. I just wondered if I could add one quite key point that I missed from my list, and that really builds on what Andreas has just said, which is on the human rights front. I think there has been, until recently, a very worrying tendency, based, I believe, actually on a myth, and the myth is that in order to trade with China, in order to have good engagement with China, you have to kowtow and you have to be silent on human rights issues, at least in public. And I've always believed that to be a myth, and I think there are other countries that have shown themselves able to speak out and still trade. But given both in mainland China and, of course, the erosion of freedom, dramatic erosion of freedom in Hong Kong, it amounts to what pretty much everyone says is the worst crackdown on human rights, certainly since the Tiananmen massacre, arguably in some respects, particularly in regard to religious freedom, since the Cultural Revolution, the situation of at least 1 million Uyghurs incarcerated in prison camps, and many other examples that I won't list here. But I think we should be speaking out much more robustly on the human rights issues, and actually looking at accountability mechanisms, particularly for what amount to mass atrocities in the case of the Uyghurs. In the Conservative Home article, we should stop Operation Kowtow and start Operation Stand Up Tall.
Couldn't agree more. Just a quick question relating to both of the points that you made. How much do you think that there's Andreas, you mentioned the sort of strategy of diplomacy that China seems to have gradually developed. It's much more aggressive and nearing on bullying, although I'm sort of hesitant to use the phrase. And also, like you say, Ben, this kowtowing. How much do you think this has to do with perception and how China wants itself to be seen, and potentially our own perception of ourselves, not just us, but also our allies, in terms of how we might potentially be underestimating our own perception of ourselves? Do you think that we might be about to see a sort of turn towards more realistic, strategic diplomacy, which perhaps, I don't know if this is something that has been lacking maybe in the last decade or so?
Yes, I mean, I think there is a combination of, we, as a generalization, I think we Brits tend to be quite self-deprecating, sometimes in a healthy, humorous way, but sometimes we talk ourselves down a bit too much. And I think we should remember that, we are still a permanent member of the Security Council, a member of all the different G groups, the G8, the G20, the Commonwealth, NATO. Okay, we've left the European Union, but there are other international alliances that we are a key player in, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I think there is, I'll never forget when Xi Jinping visited the UK in 2015, I heard an American businessman on the Today program, and he is someone who has been based in Shanghai for many years, knows China extremely well, knows how to do business with China. And he was very critical of David Cameron's government for rolling out the red carpet in such a way, and totally refusing to talk about our values, our concerns, at least in public. And he had said this phrase that has stayed with me ever since. He said, and he was trying to make the point that actually, if you stand up for your values rather than kowtow, China, okay, they may not like it, but they are more likely to respect you for doing so than if you kowtow. And he said these words, which is a direct quote and has always stayed with me. He said, if you act like a panting puppy, China will think that they have you on a leash. And I think there's a lot of truth in that actually you can have a much more mutually beneficial and effective relationship if we are seen to have respect for our own values and heritage and stand up for them.
Yeah, I would absolutely support this view. And I would like to share with you a very interesting experience that I've had in Brussels 7 years ago. I gave a talk about how the European Union and the European External Action Service could perhaps support what could be termed like unofficial China or civil society a bit more. And I thought, a really compelling argument that while we can't directly support dissidents, but neither should we uncritically just give development aid and support to the Communist Party. And so following my keynote, a Chinese diplomat raised his hand and then said the following words. He said, I strongly recommend the European External Action Service not to listen to this gentleman's presentation. And as you can imagine, there were 100 people. The temperature in the room suddenly froze. But I soon realized that this is what he kind of had to say in his official capacity. And after the panel ended, I went over to this actually young diplomat and I said, here in the UK, we can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. And he immediately said, this is what I had to say. And then we went to get a coffee. And then we had a very good conversation. And he asked me, so why do people care about human rights in China? And then we had a conversation in Chinese for about 10-15 minutes. And he ended our conversation with the words, if there were more people like you, our relationship would be better. So the same person who in front of 100 people kind of dismissed everything I said as politically incorrect and as hugely detrimental to the EU-China relationship, in private said, people like you are the people we need to have a better relationship. So all I can say is this is the kind of cognitive dissonance that we see when we deal with official China. And I think more people need to understand, these layers and these complexities.
Strategically speaking, so yesterday there was that letter that was sent to, signed by 20 MPs, was sent to Liz Truss, the Trade Secretary, asking for the government to ensure that our trade with China is more consistent with our strategic interests. And they wanted the government to reassess our trade and supply security, something that you already mentioned, Ben, in terms of diversifying our supply chains and so on. And this was in response to a report by the Henry Jackson Society that found that we were particularly dependent on China in critical areas like pharmaceuticals, antiviral drugs, antibiotics, consumer electronics, metals, things like that. and also you mentioned as well Huawei and the 5G network, and I think this has been referred to by some as the digital Silk Road. I'm not sure if I'm getting that quite right, but I was wondering whether Andreas, you agree with Bob Seeley that we need to be weaning our dependency off China. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think that connects to what you were just saying about the sort of way that the Chinese operate, which is not necessarily the same as you might expect from other countries?
Well, I recall that the Foreign Affairs Committee published a report last year, making it actually quite clear that the Chinese Communist Party is, in a way, a threat to our international liberal order. And so I think one needs to recognize that simply by us, let's say the British, the mainland Europeans, the North Americans trading with China hasn't kind of sped up, liberalization or even ushered in political democratization in China. And this is now very clear because under General Secretary Xi Jinping, we have seen really a shift from what could be termed like hard authoritarianism towards one-person dictatorship and totalitarianism. And therefore, even a commercial relationship with mainland China is not a value-free proposition. Yes, evidently, British and European traders and investors can make money in China, but whilst they are enriching themselves, they're also making, a very problematic political regime more powerful. And therefore, I would think that actually, and Ben just spoke about it, a certain extent of economic decoupling is a must, in particular in industries which are of national security interest. So IT, health industries, but I would actually even include education, for example. We have had a very worrisome like reports about the encroachment on academic autonomy, for example, not just here in the UK, but also in mainland Europe. And again, the Chinese Communist Party didn't play a positive role in this regard. And so, for example, ring fencing, the public expenditure for higher education would make sense. And going back to, let's say, a publicly funded, higher education sector is it doesn't just make sense from the interests of the British public, but it also makes national security sense.
And Ben, how does China use trade as a kind of tool for geopolitics? Because I know this is obviously a big topic with all of the stuff around the Belt and Road Initiative. What's your take on, as we were saying, that the need to decouple from wean ourselves off of our dependency on China? How do you think that we should be doing that? And what are the risks of the way that China uses trade politically in a way that other liberal democratic states wouldn't?
Well, I think there are several points on this. I think China, in its rhetoric, clearly makes a lot of threats over trade when countries do things that it doesn't like. We've seen even just in recent weeks, particularly with Australia, as Australia has talked more about the need for an international inquiry into the pandemic, the Chinese regime has made all sorts of threats about stopping the imports of Australian wine and beef and other goods. And of course, at times they do follow through on their threats, but I think more often than not, actually their bark is worse than their bite. And there've been examples, if you look back over recent years, where there might have been a temporary freeze, but at the end of the day, although the regime is ideological, they're also pragmatic in terms of wanting to sell us products that we want to buy, or buy our products and services that they want. And in the end, trade isn't as significantly impacted as people fear. So they use it as a threat, but they don't necessarily always follow through for the long term. But in answer to the second part of your question, how do we decouple? I just think that we should be, and I actually said this in an article some months ago, long before the pandemic. So actually, it's something I've been thinking about for a while, that if we want to be what the government calls global Britain, well, there's a difference between global Britain and China Britain or CCP Britain. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a relationship as much as we can with, especially the people of China, if we can minimize the links with the CCP regime. But we ought to be looking at developed economies in East Asia, like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, emerging economies like Indonesia, obviously long-standing places like Malaysia, Singapore, Latin America, and elsewhere. And I actually think we may well, this is a separate issue, but related, one of the things that may come as a result of this pandemic is we may end up actually investing more in our own production at home, which I don't think is a bad thing. I would never want us to pull up the drawbridge and say, let's do it all at home, or Britain first. That's not me. I want Britain to have very much a role in the global on the global stage, but that should be truly global, not. And I think we've put our eggs too much in one basket, and we should spread them out a bit more.
See Andreas nodding along. Have you got some thoughts on how we might decouple ourselves?
Well, actually, I just would like to add some complementary points here, because I do teach a module about EU-China relations and, of course, also UK-China relations. And my students are always actually fascinated by the following fact. You see, from our British perspective, actually British exports of goods, I should say, not services, because services are more or less restricted in the Chinese context. They only make up about 10% of British exports to the European Union. So 1/10. Also in terms of imports from China, they make up less than 20% of what we're importing from mainland Europe. So regardless of what people think about Brexit and the economic implications, I think the idea that somehow trade with China will kind of pick up the slack, so to speak, and kind of help cushion the blow of leaving the European market, I think is fanciful. But what that also means is that actually, in a way, our so-called quote unquote dependence on the Chinese market has been completely overblown. And let me just make one more point. I remember very vividly when David Cameron and George Osborne were promoting the golden era, etc. And they used these huge numbers. They spoke about 1 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion. But you see, this was all in a way propaganda, because in the big scheme of things, 1 billion or 5 billion, that's peanuts if you look at the overall trade volume, especially in terms of services, of course. And just one point, I think, that kind of, again, puts this all in perspective. In 2014, the European Commission published a memo which made it very clear that all of the European member states, their combined trade and services that they sell to Switzerland, that amount is higher than what they export to China. And no one would say, Switzerland, the market of the future. But these are some realities. Everyone can look up these statistics. So I think by perhaps infusing some of these, existing realities into the public discourse, I think perhaps politicians and decision makers would feel less compelled to, make unnecessary compromises.
Do you think that maybe the coronavirus is a mixed blessing, and that it may have sped up the process of us and other Western countries realizing that perhaps investment from China might be more of a risk than it is a benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you an example from Germany, which is my country, much longer than I have lived in Germany. But of course, I do still follow what's happening there. And the problem with German China policy, for example, is that the car manufacturing industry has an outsized influence on the government, because they do sell a lot of cars like BMWs, Audis, VWs to China. But the problem with that is that actually, in the big scheme of things, these are very narrow corporate interests that should not override, let's say, the German national interest. And in a way, as you just mentioned with COVID-19, I mean, the economic losses will be gigantic. And so in the future, I think if the CEOs of VW and BMW say, well, you need to protect our export market in China, then people can say, but COVID-19 totally, not destroyed the German economy, but led to a recession. And if you then weigh those two things against each other, then it's quite clear that these very narrow corporate interests should not trump the national interest.
Mm-hmm. Ben, what do you think about the sort of the risks of Chinese investment? Because I know there's been a lot of talk about particular countries that get a lot of investment from China and then they end up completely indebted to them and vulnerable to their bullying tactics. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a very big concern, and I mean we see that particularly in the what we generally term the developing world. It's not a phrase I really like, but people know what I mean by that. Where, for example, in somewhere like Sri Lanka, China now effectively owns the port. They own ports, I think, in a number of other countries, and quite a number of countries have found what appeared to be much needed assistance has turned out to be a kind of stranglehold on them, where when they are unable to pay back the debt that they owe, China then ends up actually having control of strategic things like ports. And we talked earlier about certain sectors, even in our own economy. I hope we never end up in that situation of actually being so indebted to China that they take control because we have no choice. But at the moment, we do have a choice, but we're actually voluntarily giving them stakes in British Steel, and we're talking about Huawei, and we had the nuclear power issue with Hinkley Point, and it just seems to me, and there was talk, of course, of the high-speed rail link giving Chinese companies a stake in that too, and it seems to me to be mad. Ian Duncan Smith, in a debate on Huawei earlier this year, said that we would not. And I don't, Andreas, forgive me, this may or may not be appropriate analogy, but I'm quoting Ian Duncan Smith. He said, we would not have given a stake in our telecommunications network in the 1930s to German companies that were involved in providing surveillance for Auschwitz. And we wouldn't. And so why are we doing that with Huawei? So I think there are all sorts of issues and dangers with not all kinds of Chinese investment, but certain sectors and certain ways.
James Forsyth wrote an article in The Spectator where he basically said that he thinks that Sinoscepticism is going to become a feature of the Tory party going forward, and actually that it might serve as a kind of unifying force after Brexit. And if that is the case, then we might see it's likely that we will see the left going in the opposite direction and being, I suppose you could call it, sinophilic. What do you think that there is, and this is a big question, and we've covered some of it already, but what do you think that there is to be skeptical about China? What is the nature of the Chinese state? I know that, Andreas, you've spoken about this before, and the sort of the ways in which China is a communist country. What are the things that we should be wary about?
It's an excellent question, and sometimes people ask me, why should we care, for example, about how China is being governed? Yeah, and often it's very hard-nosed realists who kind of put this to me, but I tend to answer this way. It matters because, of course, the Chinese Communist Party tries to protect its authority within China. They do so through carrots and sticks, and I call them like the rule by bribery and rule by fear. But they have a problem, and that is, of course, there are Chinese people all around the world in the Chinese diasporas, and they cannot be sure that about their loyalties. Now, that shouldn't be even a question, because often our Chinese friends are then naturalized Australians or British or Americans. But what the Chinese Communist Party really worries about is that, for example, dissident community would gain support among overseas Chinese, ethnically Chinese, or people would still speak Chinese and have perhaps family in China. And since these are our neighbors, our friends, for example, here in the UK, since we live in an open, liberal, democratic society, it should really concern us that they're still subject to those political pressures. And they are, in a way, just partially free. Because let's say if you were a Chinese living in the UK and you're openly critical of the Chinese party state, you may get into real trouble. It's not just people like Ben and I who are getting like, some unwanted attention and harassment, but just think about our Chinese friends. Now, and understandably, then a lot of people decide not to speak up. But this is a form of censorship that goes beyond the shores of mainland China. And I don't have like a solution to this problem, but I think this is something we really need to address, because we need to ensure that everyone in the UK can speak his or her mind freely and without fear or favor. But right now, I don't think we can ensure this, and that is unsustainable.
Ben, what do you think specifically from the human rights perspective? Because I know that's your area of real expertise. What is what is the Chinese Communist Party? What is the Chinese state? What's its nature? What should we be skeptical about and worried about?
Well, its nature, ever since over the last 70 years, has to varying degrees been to control, to repress, to stamp out any kind of perceived opposition or criticism. But I think there is a difference, or a difference of degree under Xi Jinping, in that over the sort of 40 years from the late 1970s until Xi Jinping came along, there were, apart from obviously the Tiananmen massacre and other moments, but there were periods, especially in the early 2000s, where there was a comparative relaxation. And I'm not saying that it was all sort of free and happy. Of course, it was still restricted, it was still repressive, but there was nevertheless a comparative opening up. I remember about 10 years ago meeting a group of Chinese human rights lawyers in Beijing in a restaurant, very openly at the table, talking about their own work and the prospects for reform. I met bloggers, I met civil society activists, all of whom were followed, were surveyed, but were basically allowed within certain limitations to do what they were doing. And under Xi Jinping, all of that has disappeared. The lawyers that I met were either jailed, disbarred, or literally disappeared, and we don't know where they are. So there's been a significant crackdown on civil society, on lawyers, on bloggers, on journalists. We see, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the situation of the Uyghurs, the most severe crackdown on Christians that there has been since the Cultural Revolution, arguably. And a lot of this is also tied to the first personality cult that we've seen in China since Mao. You didn't see pictures of Deng Xiaoping or Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin very much. But now in churches in China, state-controlled churches, pictures of Xi Jinping, party banners, party propaganda are being put up alongside religious symbols. And then lastly, of course, with, as I mentioned earlier, the situation in Hong Kong. And I think there are two things to say in summary on this overall human rights situation. One is that all of the human rights violations, and especially those that reach the level of mass atrocities, are violations of international human rights laws and norms. And therefore, if we believe in the various international treaties, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other documents, if we believe in the international rules-based order, we have an interest in speaking out against those atrocities. We do it with other countries, and China seems to have this exceptionalism where we are nervous about speaking out, and we shouldn't be. But in the particular case of Hong Kong, we have an added both interest and responsibility for two reasons. Firstly, Hong Kong is still a major financial hub, but its success as a financial hub is underpinned by the principles of the rule of law, transparency, openness, and Hong Kong's autonomy. And if those pillars are continue to be eroded, as they are increasingly so, Hong Kong's viability as a financial hub is called into question. That ought to be of concern to everybody. But even more importantly, China signed an international treaty with the United Kingdom, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is lodged at the United Nations, and it's now trampling all over it. And if we're not willing to stand up for what we signed up for in that treaty, then we're allowing China not just to trample on Hong Kong's freedoms, but actually to trample on the international rules-based order.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, we were talking before about the importance of transparency, because it has real implications in terms of global health, obviously. So presumably there's an interest in terms of our own selfish interests as a nation to try to bolster freedom of religion, freedom of expression, human rights in China, so that we can push them perhaps towards the kind of transparency that is also a defense, not just for us, but also for minorities and the majority population in China. How do you think that we can work towards that in China, given that there's obviously this censorious element, and China has obviously been quite adept at censoring criticism even outside of its borders? What's the if you had any recommendation of how we might go about, or even the government might develop policies that would help to support that? I know, Andreas, you mentioned supporting civil society. Do you have any ideas on how we might do that, or is it an impossibility? Andreas?
Okay, I think one really hard nut to crack, but ultimately, this is something that should be discussed, by politicians and foreign policy makers, is under the conditions of what is often called the Great Firewall of China, which is, of course, the censorship of the Chinese internet. It is very difficult, I think, for us to actually have an open-ended dialogue with our Chinese friends. Because if the Chinese Communist Party has the ability to shield the Chinese population from what they deem inappropriate information, then we're always going to deal with this information asymmetry. It doesn't mean that, of course, our counterparts are not well informed. There are people who use the VPNs and who are also active, let's say, even on Twitter. But you see, for the broad masses of people, I think the Great Firewall is a big problem. And to have an entire country basically running its own intranet is the opposite of a global or international community. And then, of course, add to that the language barrier and cultural differences. All of that makes it even more complicated on both sides to have a constructive dialogue. And so perhaps depending on whether or not, for example, this investigation into the origins of COVID-19, how that makes headway. If, for example, the authorities say we will not have it, then perhaps a rather unfriendly countermeasure would be to say, okay, we will provide free internet in China by sending up more satellites and ensuring that whoever in China wants to go online can do so. These are ideas that have already been developed and shared in previous years. Now, how realistic is it that Western liberal democracies will get their act together and do this? I don't know, but maybe it's about time to have these conversations, because otherwise, we will always have to kind of deal with the Great Firewall of China, and it's neither in the interest of the good people of China, nor is it in our interest.
Ben, how should we scale the Great Firewall of China? Besiege it?
Well, I very much agree with what Andreas has said, and I think it ought to be a priority. I obviously, like all of us, I use the internet, but I'm absolutely no technological expert, so I don't know the mechanics of how you do it. But if it can be done, absolutely. I think I've done a lot of work on North Korea as well, and one of the main sort of themes of my advocacy on North Korea is to break what we call the information blockade by the North Korean regime. And I think the same applies, perhaps even more so, to China. So we should definitely be doing that. But if I may, could I just add one other thing that on the human rights front, I think we should also be doing, which is that there's been a lot of talk in the last year or so about Magnitsky-style sanctions generally. And I know that from what I hear, that Dominic Raab, as Foreign Secretary, is a real champion of Magnitsky-style sanctions in general. I think as a backbencher, he was one of the leading proponents of the initial legislation. The government's committed to putting forward the secondary legislation to establish the framework for the sanctions. I know that's been delayed because of the pandemic, but everything I hear indicates that Dominic Raab believes in this. But if you don't apply Magnitsky sanctions to individuals in the Chinese Communist Party who are responsible for the incarceration, the torture, the slavery of more than 1 million Uyghurs and many other human rights abuses, who do you apply them to? If you can't apply them to one of the worst human rights situations in the world, then of what value are they? So I would argue looking at applying Magnitsky sanctions to targeted individuals, not China as a country, not ordinary Chinese people, not blanket sanctions, but targeted sanctions, I think should be in the toolbox.
Before we move on to talk a little bit more about the Chinese censorship or the CCP censorship, I was wondering if you'd both be able to tell our viewers or our listeners a little bit more about your own personal experiences of backlash against your own activism, or in your case, Andreas, your academic work on the subject. Ben, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll try to condense it because it's quite a long list, but very briefly, I've had several forms of this sort of pressure from the Chinese Communist Party. The most obvious was obviously in October 2017. I tried to go to Hong Kong. I had lived in Hong Kong for 5 years previously, for the first 5 years after the handover from 1997 to 2002. And when I went back, and I'd been back many times over the years, but when I went back in October 2017, I was taken aside at the airport and told that on the instructions of Beijing, I was not welcome in Hong Kong, and I was put back on a plane. And since my case, there have been a number of other foreigners who've had the same thing happen. And in fact, the Financial Times Asia news editor, who'd been based in Hong Kong, was expelled from Hong Kong. But I think I was certainly one of the first Westerners to have this happen. Some advantage to that incident, although I would never have sought it and definitely didn't want it, was that it did generate quite a lot of publicity. And I very much encouraged people to turn that publicity into attention on Hong Kong. I didn't want publicity for myself, but if it could be used to spotlight what we were already seeing then, and it's got much worse since, but the erosion of freedom in Hong Kong and autonomy, then I wanted it to serve that good purpose. And it drew a statement from the Foreign Secretary at the time, who's now the Prime Minister. It was raised in both houses of Parliament and got quite a lot of media attention. But since then, I've had a few other things. I've had, for example, a succession of anonymous letters coming to my home address in London. My home address isn't readily available. Clearly, you can find it, but it's not something I advertise. But not only my home address, but also some of my, all of my neighbours in the street that I live in London. So the first letter that came had my picture on it and the words "watch him," and it was addressed to dear resident. This person lives in your street. Will you please keep an eye on him, find out what his activities are? And thankfully, thankfully my neighbors are kind of bright enough to, even though they didn't know me, to not believe it, and it was fine. But I had probably 20 or so of those letters. My mother, who lives in a different part of the country, received probably half a dozen or so letters saying, will you please tell your son to stop doing what he's doing? And she just laughed and said, I gave up trying that years ago. And my employers also had one letter saying that, you know, if I didn't stop what I was doing, my well-being could not be guaranteed. I've also had emails saying the same thing. Whoever is behind this seemed to start off with post and then sort of moved into the 21st century a bit belatedly and started causing chaos on email, both with me and then by sending fake email addresses in my name. And Andreas, I'm sure, will want to add to this, but emails using my name in a totally fake email address that have been sent to MPs and prominent journalists and others. But then if I can just briefly add two other types of activity, I have had at least 4 different members of parliament on 4 different occasions telling me that in various ways they have had either phone calls or it's come up in face-to-face meetings with the Chinese ambassador or the Chinese embassy, specifically asking them to tell me to stop speaking out. And to their credit, all 4 MPs, you know, made it clear they were not telling me to stop. They were just letting me know that they'd had these lobbying efforts by the Chinese embassy. And then very finally, there was the incident you may be aware of at the Conservative Party conference in 2018, where a Chinese state television reporter actually ended up physically assaulting a volunteer, and that was caught on camera. And in fact, she ended up being convicted of common assault. I was not the person who got physically assaulted, but I was the initial target of her aggression when she disrupted a fringe meeting at the party conference with 3 very prominent Hong Kong activists and myself. And when I was making my closing remarks, she started really screaming at me. And it was interesting, actually, the thing that caused her to be so angry is very relevant to the topic we're discussing today, because I had said in my closing remarks that I wanted to emphasize I am not anti-China. In fact, I'm very pro-China as a country and as a people. I am critical of the Chinese Communist Party regime. And she then started really screaming at me furiously, saying that I was a liar and that I was trying to destroy China, as if I had that capacity, and that I was, you know, a threat to China. So that was, and I'm sure it was not an impromptu moment. I'm sure it was planned and staged, and she seized her moment at that point to presumably send me a message that they're watching me and they're interested. I'm just amazed that a country of that size, and supposedly a country that wants to be seen as a superpower, for example, begins a meeting with an MP, as happened, the meeting that was supposed to be talking about global issues like climate change and trade and other key international issues. The first thing on their agenda was, will you please get Ben Rogers to shut up? And I'm rather surprised by that.
Is this all very familiar to you, Andreas?
Well,
your experience?
Ben and I were meeting, let's say, virtually for the first time, but we do know each other. And Ben, another Hong Kong and human rights activist, Luc de Pulfort, and actually also the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Tugendhat, including myself, we all have been victims of a cyberbullying and smear campaign over the past 6 months at least. And in the case of Ben, this goes back even a couple of years now. And I wrote a memo for the Foreign Affairs, for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in February, which I made public in end of April, also with the intent to actually make the wider public aware what actually happens when you publicly criticize the Chinese party state. because previously, very often in conversations that I've had with colleagues, but also, members of the public, they would say, well, maybe isn't this kind of threat of the Chinese Communist Party overblown? I mean, how much can they really influence and interfere in our domestic affairs here in the UK? But, here we are, where, a very prominent British politician, two very outspoken British human rights activists, and a German national who happens to live and work in Nottingham and study China, Taiwan, Hong Kong. We're all at the receiving end of online harassment. And this really kind of underscores that the Chinese Communist Party does care what Ben is saying or I'm saying. Now, I sometimes just find it also amusing in a way, because our influence, if one is perfectly honest, is still very limited. I mean, I'm glad that people are listening to what I have to say, and I think having these conversations is great, but it's not like I'm the personal advisor to Prime Minister Johnson, or I'm ghostwriting, the China policy of this government. And so to see, that perhaps agents of the Chinese state or non-state agents who feel compelled to act in the interest of the Communist Party are doing this in a very systematic way, speaks to kind of the nature of the problem we're dealing with.
Would I be right to say that, Andreas, you've had some issues where you've been accused of being racist because of, was it an open letter that you had arranged with some other academics who decided then not to sign it? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about that, because it's actually linked indeed to this cyberbullying and harassment campaign, but also we can talk, of course, a little bit about this entire issue of whether a critique of the Communist Party amounts to like racism. About a month ago, there were 100 what could be called establishment scholars in China who published an open letter, kind of defending the Communist Party, the Chinese government's handling of the crisis. And when I read this, and some of my associates read it, we felt like this is not good. This is not acceptable, because here Chinese society is actually being used by the party to kind of do the party's bidding. And so we felt compelled we should respond to that. So we drafted an open letter that Ben has signed and many others have signed. We have now more than 200 signatories. They are public figures, security analysts, and China specialists. And that is a good sign. It also shows that there are more and more people who are not just unhappy about what the Communist Party did or didn't, in this case informing international society, but we also, in that open letter, actually emphasized how many critical intellectuals, but also health professionals and citizen journalists actually tried to create transparency and report and warn not just the Chinese public, but also the international community about the dangers of this virus. But what I found very interesting is that when we canvassed for signatories and asked people to sign, some people said, I'm not into this. I like to do academic research. I don't do advocacy, and that's fine. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason not to sign. But there were also individuals who told me, I agree with what you write. Whatever you say in that letter is correct. But I don't want to put my name to this because I'm afraid I might be kind of seen as kind of almost similar to the Trump administration, because they're very outspoken in their criticism of China and the Communist Party. And I just dislike Trump and what he and his administration stands for. And that's why I'm not going to sign a letter that is actually critical of the Chinese Communist Party. And that gave me a lot of food for thought, because I thought, like, if, let's say, quote unquote, progressives in Europe, but also in the United States, are afraid to sign an open letter that is perfectly fine, which expresses explicit kind of solidarity with the good people of China, and happens to be critical, of course, of the Communist Party, just because they don't want to be lumped together with, the Trump administration, then this is really a problem, because it does undermine our freedom of speech. It is kind of probably tied into, the kind of culture wars that we see in Europe and in the United States. And I think it's very unhealthy because it deprives, in a way, that the public discourse of these voices.
This brings us very neatly onto the subject of Sinophobia, which is a term that Sinoscepticism, I think, is something that was probably more widely used, whereas in the last couple of weeks I've seen the word Sinophobia seems to be more in use, especially on Twitter. If viewers or listeners want to look up the hashtag Sinophobia on Twitter to see the sorts of things that are being accused of that. For example, that Chinese profiteers were being would be sent to jail for sending COVID-19 supplies to China. And that was accused of, and this is a quote, echoes of Sinophobia in 19th century Australia. And so obviously we've seen an increase in recorded attacks on Asian people, Chinese people. And this seems to be lumped together with criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you look at the way that the accusation of Sinophobia is used, it seems to be used against people who are making these criticisms. And that's interesting because if we look at the way that other phobias have been used in the past, so for example, the use of Islamophobia against people who are making criticisms of Islamic belief or practice, we might expect that this could be something that turns into a bit of a problem when it comes to being able to point out, as already there seems to be an issue, not only from the censorship coming from China itself, but also self-censorship from people in Western countries. This might turn out to make it even more difficult to highlight the sorts of things that we're not talking about in terms of China's behaviour that we seem to sort of turn a blind eye to under normal circumstances. And I think, especially as we saw with the World Health Organization, the very first thing that they seemed to do was come out saying that actually stigma was more dangerous than the virus itself. And then to give advice on what language we should use when talking about the virus, talking about the Wuhan, not talking about the Wuhan virus, Chinese virus, Asian virus, and so on. So I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on whether you think that Sinophobia is going to become the new phobia in vogue, and whether you think that it's likely that might be used to silence criticism of the CCP, and if so, what might we be able to do to stop that from happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a real concern, and I was shocked in recent months to see some of the incidents of violent attacks or verbal abuse of ethnic Chinese, and in some cases not even ethnic Chinese, but East Asian people. There was the Singaporean young man who was badly physically attacked in Oxford Street, I think, and there've been other cases. And I've been very very proactive on my social media and in any other opportunity to condemn such incidences for two reasons. I mean, firstly, I would do so anyway, just morally, and I think, like all forms of racism, that they're basically based on real ignorance and stupidity. East Asian, because of the actions of the CCP, is absurd. It makes no sense. So it's right to take a strong stand against it on principle and on moral grounds. But I think it's also really important in terms of how we deal with the CCP and in terms of getting the message that we've been conveying in this discussion across. Because if we aren't clear that we stand against xenophobia and against anti-Chinese racism, that will play into the CCP's agenda of trying to make this narrative about a clash between China and the West. And it shouldn't be that. It should be about a struggle between the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, the rule of law, versus repression and authoritarianism and mendacity. And so we should be really clear that our focus is the CCP. We should be consistently not just condemning, but trying to find ways to counter real xenophobia. And you mentioned the parallel with Islamophobia, and that's something I've thought about quite a lot, because in that context, I would distinguish between actually three things. Radical Islamism, which is the ideology that we should be, and the jihadi actions that go with it that we should be opposing. Islam as a whole, which is a religion with a whole variety of interpretations and a rich culture and history that we may agree or disagree with different practices, but as a whole, I think we should respect, because you can't generalize anyway about it with its variety of interpretations. And then Muslim people, who we should absolutely be protecting and condemning acts of racism against them. And in the same way with China, the CCP is the radical Islamism equivalent on this trajectory. China as a culture, as a nation, is, of course, it's not a religion, but the parallel is there with Islam in terms of how we should respect it, and Chinese people who we should be defending and actually working to help, because they're the primary victims of the CCP. We shouldn't be holding them responsible. We should be trying to help them find their freedom.
Andreas, what are your thoughts?
Well, Ben made such an eloquent case that, of course, we should fight racism in all their forms, whether it's Islamophobia, Sinophobia. So there's really not that much that I can add points. I would just add perhaps like another insight. We are all victims in a way of the Chinese Communist Party. As we discussed, Ben and I and others, we've been harassed for being outspoken about, the Communist Party's actions in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong and other places. But of course, the Chinese diaspora is in a way also under pressure. And as I said before, speak without fear or favor. But if their speech on social media and elsewhere is being monitored, and they feel they cannot, let's say, criticize the Communist Party, then we do have a problem. And so, this idea that criticism of a political regime amounts to a kind of racism is just nonsensical, because it rests on the assumption that there is a unity between the party and the people, that there's a complete match between the rulers and the ruled. But that's of course not the case in China. But the Communist Party has some popular support, I would concede that, but it doesn't have democratic political legitimacy. And so the idea that somehow the party state kind of speaks on behalf of the Chinese people, not just in mainland China, but also around the world, is fanciful. And so I think as a good practice, and Ben is doing this, I'm doing this, leading politicians like Pompeo do that, we should always distinguish between the good people in China and the party. They're not the same.
So the hour has absolutely flown by. Just before we end the podcast, I'd like to ask you just for some final thoughts on how you think this will affect the sort of post-coronavirus global order, and what impact do you think all of this is going to have on China's influence globally? Ben, would you like to give your final thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I think that I would never, obviously, believed, and certainly would never have wished for a global pandemic with the terrible consequences to wake people up. I wish we could have woken up without such a high price. But if there is one good thing to come out of this terrible time, I hope that it will be a complete reevaluation of how we engage with the Chinese Communist Party. And I think I do see encouraging signs of that happening, both among politicians in the UK, who we've talked about, and of course in the United States. But also what's interesting is, and I know we don't have time to get into this, but something that's emerged in recent months is the way that Africans in China have been treated in the context of COVID-19, and they've been subjected is leveled against critics of the CCP, there's a very strong charge of racism in the way that that foreigners, particularly Africans, have been treated in China, and that has caused African countries that previously had a very strong relationship with China and with the CCP to be critical in an unprecedented way. So I think there could be rethinking, not only in the West, but around the world. I think the CCP's handling of this has really damaged its reputation in the world, but helped people to wake up to the dangers. And I hope there will be a real rethinking that, and who knows, maybe, I know people say this could be China's Chernobyl moment, in that it could lead to the undermining and the eventual collapse of the regime. I'm not making that prediction, but I'm sort of posing that question out there, that could we see a rethinking that is not just a rethinking in foreign policy towards China, but actually a rethinking within China itself that might lead to some positive change.
Allow us to overcome this impossible binary choice between being either a Sinophile or a Sinophobe. This is just not the choice ahead of us. Instead, I think it's high time that we start distinguishing between what could be termed official China. These are the organizations and individuals, networks who are under control of the Communist Party, and what could be termed unofficial China. And those are the independent-minded academics, public interest lawyers, writers, journalists, and it is unofficial China that we should pay more attention to. And I think it's high time for us as members of the international community to stand in solidarity with the good people in mainland China who are calling for greater freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining me. This has been it run right over time. I hope everybody who is watching has enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, subscribe, keep an eye out for our future podcasts, and thank you very much for watching.